Hi there, I'm James Bachner, and you're listening to The Drop on 102.7 CHOP FM. As an extension of York Region's strategy for youth homelessness prevention and housing stabilization, this show is dedicated to discussing youth homelessness, risk factors, and available resources. Last episode, we spoke about shelter life, where many systemic issues in our systems were highlighted. This month, we'll be giving you the drop on the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Subcommittee of the Youth Strategy. I'm joined today by two special guests, Charlotte Lombardo and Jericho Espinas. Thank you for being here today, Charlotte and Jericho. So Charlotte is a community-based researcher and educator, and Jericho is a community-based lawyer and nonprofit manager. Both are members of the Youth Strategies Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Subcommittee, also known as the EDI team. So to begin, I was wondering if you could explain just a little bit about what equity, diversity, and inclusion is, and just give our listeners a background on why it's important. And I'll extend this one to Charlotte.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I think you addressed some of this even in the outset when you talked about the purpose of this podcast. But when we're looking at issues like youth homelessness, we're really looking at issues of equity and oppression, right? We're looking at who is most impacted by homelessness because they're experiencing systemic inequities. And so things like poverty, racism, gender discrimination, these are reasons that people might end up finding themselves in an experience of homelessness. So we really have to take an equity-centered, equity-oriented approach when we understand that that's the root cause of these problems. So equity is really about allocating resources to meet need. So rather than giving everybody the same thing, we're allocating resources based on what they're going through, recognizing that everybody's needs are different because of issues of equity and oppression. And so at the same time, we're thinking about issues of diversity. Different people come with different experiences in the world, different experiences of equity and also different experiences of privilege. And sometimes those are intersectional. Sometimes you can experience privilege because of your race and discrimination because of your gender or your gender orientation. It's a complicated factors that we're looking at when we're thinking about equity and discrimination and inclusion and who needs to be at the table so we understand how to build a strategy that addresses diverse needs. And so it's also about representation. It's also about ensuring that we have the voices of the people who've experienced these issues and also just these social experiences of the world so that we can really be building a strategy that addresses these complex realities, these complex lived realities. And so that's the overarching concept of equity, diversity, and inclusion, that we need to analyze and look at multiple factors to promote the success of individuals who are experiencing systemic issues like homelessness. And so we want to take a real reflective and inclusive approach to understanding how to address these issues within a strategy like this.
And I really like that point you made about equity, diversity, and inclusion not necessarily being a binary between privilege and discrimination. It's sort of a multidimensional thing where you can experience different aspects of both.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and I love the point about how it's a reflection of the complex lived realities, especially in the context of a youth strategy that is so cross-sectoral, that has, for example, Blue Door, my org, which provides social services to individuals experiencing homelessness. But we also have, for example, the school board involved, and other major stakeholders that provide services or provide supports to these youth. So it's important to have all of these perspectives when trying to think about EDI for the youth strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jericho, would you mind speaking a little bit about the work that the EDI team is doing within the youth strategy?
hmm Yeah, I think to start for the EDI committee, the youth strategy thought of the EDI committee as almost providing a review for the work plans that the subcommittees were creating. But when we actually sat down and had conversations with each other about what we wanted this EDI committee to accomplish, we really shifted the focus to being one that is more principles based, one where it isn't merely a checklist that the strategy can say we've done, or this committee has done the work, but rather something that is embodied throughout all of the committees, all of the major stakeholders and players at the table. Because at least for our group, I think it is important that it is a self-reflective exercise for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to take a second to sort of step outside of the youth strategy and just talk about what EDI means to you both on a personal level. So if you wouldn't mind speaking on that and just some of the work you do outside of the youth strategy, sort of a secondary introduction here.
Sure. So my work for some time has been located in community-based research, and this is an area of research that recognizes that research is often a tool of privilege. It's often done by people who are experiencing higher classes in society, that research hierarchies mirror social hierarchies. And so research has actually been either a tool to promote the interests of people with really good amounts of privilege or those who have access to determining the decision making in societies, and sometimes even a tool of violence and oppression. So, community based research is a way of trying to flip that power dynamic, and working with community members as researchers, promoting diversity in the research process, promoting diversity in the academic system, as a way of dealing with those power dynamics. And so, obviously, equity is a central tenet of recognizing and reversing the ways that research can be a tool of privilege. And so I've been working for some time with young people in that respect. So not only is research a tool of sort of a white sort of patriarchal system, it's also something that is usually done by older people, and young people don't often have their questions addressed in research because they're not the ones defining the research agendas. And so it's about also reversing that. And so as a researcher, I'm not there to say what gets researched and how. As a community-based researcher, I'm there to work with young people to identify what they think is important and surface their knowledge as people who are having their own sort of area of expertise of their lives.
That's really refreshing to hear coming from a researcher too, because like a lot of the work I've been doing in food sovereignty hasn't been about food sovereignty itself, but more so the limitations of research surrounding food sovereignty. And a lot of the time, you have researchers coming in with an academic agenda and X amount of funding to be used for this very particular set of questions that aren't necessarily answering any of the hard-hitting topics that are providing any sort of solutions to the people who are involved. So I like the idea of community-based research where you're actually informing the research process with the people that it concerns.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. And it's not always easy to do that. So
Yeah.
it's a great principle, but because of the way our research institutions and funding envelopes are set up, it can be a challenge. So even when people in places like food sovereignty want to do that, they also have defined ideas set up. So you might be experiencing that researchers are coming in without having consulted the community as much as they should. So it's an important space, but it's like a lot of equity work. It's also a challenging space
Absolutely.
to
Yeah.
reposition those dynamics. But of course, as you just alluded to, if you don't ask the right questions, you're not necessarily going to get to the right answers. And the people who know what the problems are probably know how to address those problems better than those of us who might be outside of it and think that we're doing a good job of reviewing documents or reviewing existing
Hmm.
research to understand the problem. But that isn't quite equitable if we're not engaging people from the outset who really do understand the problem from actually living it.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll extend the same question to you, Jericho. What's some of the work that you've done outside of the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think Charlotte brings up a really great point about involving um, community members from the outset, those who actually have to live through these realities as well. I think that is also something that service providers need to always think about when developing their programs is this client centered? Is this actually grounded within the needs of the community members? Are we actually involving those individuals within the actual program development process? Otherwise, it's just the service provider um, from a top down level perspective imposing what they think is the appropriate solution or the appropriate program onto the clients that actually need those services the most. So it is about challenging those similar types of power dynamics between clients and service providers. And so I think my org, Blue Door, does a pretty good job in thinking about the needs of clients and making it client centered. And I think one of the really great programs that came out of these consultations is the inclusion program, which is the very first to us LGBTQ plus supportive housing program in York Region that came directly from recognizing the needs of those community members.
For anyone just tuning in, you're listening to The Drop, brought to you by York Region's Youth Strategy on 102.7 CHOP FM. Yeah, it sounds like great work. And hearing you both talk about this is kind of tying together a lot of what I've been noticing in the youth strategy, which is this common theme of accompaniment in learning instead of that teacher to student or caseworker to client relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think within the youth strategy space, it's great that you have a steering committee that has service providers and youth there, but also a youth council that is like by youth for youth,
Mm-hmm.
so that it really allows youth to be able to make decisions for themselves on how they want this strategy to look, which I think is incredibly important.
Yeah, it is kind of participatory research in itself.
Mhm.
But I also want to talk about how we all came to be a part of this space, because I know we kind of all came to the EDI team through different routes. So maybe I'll start with you, because I think you might predate me on this team.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was already involved in a few other subcommittees. So I'm co-chairing the evaluation subcommittee for the youth strategy. And when I was in the steering committee, probably December, wintertime last year in 2021, there were, 2020, I suppose. 2020?
I think so. Time gets a little weird.
Time gets weird
Global
with a pandemic.
pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Either way, I was involved with the youth strategy as part of the eval subcommittee, and they wanted more members to be involved with the EDI subcommittee. So I volunteered because I thought I could provide a good perspective based on where I am.
And it was sort of like a nascent space when you joined it, right?
I think youth strategy, we recognized that there was a need for an EDI subcommittee within the broader strategy, but they were still looking for individuals to help to lead that team. And I think that that's why there was that shift in focus from when they first started thinking about the EDI subcommittee, having it be that reviewer. And then when we stepped in and had those discussions, realized that it needs to be more than a review, but rather a process and a way for these principles to be reflected throughout the strategy.
For sure. And I know I kind of recruited you for this one because we'd known each other through York. But what was, I guess, your main reason for wanting to get involved?
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons you approached me is knowing about work that I'm doing with young people in Toronto through an arts agency called Sketch. That agency focuses on working with young people through this youth engagement kind of process that I referred to in terms of youth participatory research. So it's broader than research. It's also about service delivery and practice, but it's about this concept of youth engagement. And I think that's also reflected in your steering committee in this project. So it's all about youth engagement. And I'm engaged in youth engagement through Sketch that does recruit young people that have experiences of homelessness and houselessness. So it's about using arts-based approaches to reflect on and build strategies for how to work with and address these issues. And the project that I'm working on right now called Reconstructions of Home is actually an arts-based dialogue storytelling process where young people are talking about the challenges of street life, but also some of the community that has been built on the streets. So trying to challenge the stereotypes, the negative stereotypes that we sometimes have of street-involved young people. Recognizing the diversity of experience, recognizing that's a lot of challenge and that nobody really wants to live homeless, but also that there is alternative innovative communities that are built when people are forced into these inequitable spaces, and allowing them to represent that community. So if people are interested in that project, you can go to sketch.ca under public art projects, and you can look at the storytelling processes that have been surfaced through Reconstructions of Home.
So it sounds like both of you have a pretty extensive background in EDI-related work. Personally, I do come from an inclusive recreation background, teaching a lot of like swimming and recreational activities to people of different ages and abilities. So it's something I'm interested in, but it's definitely nice to work alongside people who have a little more experience with community-based organizations and participatory research. I am interested to talk a little bit more about the evolution of the EDI framework itself and sort of where we're at in that process as a team. So maybe I'll extend that question to Charlotte.
Sure. Yeah, and just to kind of pick up on what you were saying, I think we've had a really nice discussion-oriented environment where people really recognize the perspectives and the experiences that people are bringing to the table. And so it hasn't been a sort of like, we have this meeting, checklist, got to get it done. It's more like an open space for reflection and discussion. And I think that, as Jericho has mentioned a couple of times, that is really where the framework is starting to really evolve. So as opposed to being a separate part of the strategy that we say, yes, we have an EDI checklist, and then we never look at it again. It's actually a cross-cutting principles-based approach. So how can we help provide through our leadership as a committee a set of guidelines that then the entire strategy could use to reflect on how they're doing inclusivity in their programming, no matter what part of the strategy it is. So, really kind of evolving from a separate silo to a cross-cutting approach to the strategy, and consulting as well, which I think Jericho can speak to, working from the region, consulting with local organizations that are in the equity space. Because I think the other thing that's really reflected a lot in our discussions is how equity and diversity, because of the kind of things that I talked about at the outset, are really context-driven things. There's very important principles that we can probably all agree are part of an equity strategy, but those principles, the way they get actually rolled out in practice, are related to the context. And so an equity strategy in this region is going to look very different than an equity strategy in, downtown Toronto or in a much smaller rural area. And that's the process of reflection and sort of living process that we've really tried to center as a committee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important, as Charlotte just said, to recognize that EDI is that living process, is that perpetually learning process. There isn't really an end point to the work because it's always that process of self-reflection. To that end, though, I think in terms of the steps that we've done, we initially came to the table with some rough resources on how to think about EDI. So I know we looked at some of the EDI documents that Newmarket created, that CARE, one of the other partner organizations, developed, that the Youth Council created. So it really gave us a rich set of resources to sit down and really think about the work that we wanted to do, grounded within some of the organizations that are in York Region. And after we started to develop these principles, we recognized that it needed to be something that is cross-cutting, as Charlotte mentioned. And so we've set up seminars by other organizations working within this EDI space in York Region to help not just the EDI subcommittee, but all of the participants of the youth strategy to provide that EDI context, that EDI lens, those self-reflective toolkits, etc. So at the moment, we've engaged with the Newmarket African Caribbean Canadian Association and Unlearn as two really great facilitators for these sorts of workshops so that we can start to think in a more critical way about these issues.
Yeah, I found the NACA training to be really helpful. They did a really good job of framing the slave trade in a broader sort of geopolitical context. And I really enjoyed the work we've been doing with Unlearn. What I like about Unlearn is they're actually an organization that does a lot of the training, EDI-related training for the York Region District School Board. So that's a pretty good amount of credibility coming from just that. But having worked with them, I like the way they frame things. They sort of, one thing I learned from one of their workshops was to call people in instead of calling them out on EDI-related issues. And I really like that approach because I think when you try to call people out on something, you put yourself in a position, you put them in a position where they kind of feel backed into a corner and they're less willing to learn about these things. And learning about EDI requires stepping out of your comfort zone a little bit and acknowledging personal bias. So I really enjoy that approach. I also like that when we did some consultations, I know with Unlearn, and they had a lot of good stuff to bring to the table. And one of the biggest things I think was, I believe Luck Deep was the one who suggested it, is that we incorporate the idea of listening and compassion directly into our framework. And that sort of set us on this path of, instead of having this really rigid checklist that sort of was the goal from the outset, we now have sort of a categorized but living document, and we can fit questions and points that make sense into each of those categories.
Yeah, exactly. I think those are the principles that we're trying to articulate, that are living principles, that then become ways of reflecting on how we do diversity and inclusion work in different parts of the strategy. And yes, I love that you mentioned in a practical way that Unlearn helped us develop the concept of listening and compassion as being one of the main principles that we'll be putting forward in this framework, in this principles based framework. So who are we listening to? Who's most affected by the question that we're asking at this time, whether it's developing a script for something that we're putting out in terms of educational materials or other kinds of things, or service providers. And so like really kind of focusing in on those questions of listening. Some of the other pieces we have in the current evolving document is questions of representation. So who's being portrayed in this body of work, and have they been included in the messages that are being developed? So again, that real kind of inclusive focus of working with the people who are actually being addressed in these questions. Also reflecting on stereotypes that we might not realize are there. There's an interesting principle of that sometimes when we think about stereotypes, it's because there's one type of story that's told about a group of people. So the danger of the single story, and making sure that we're not just referring back to that single story, whether it's the disempowered young person who's sleeping on the streets. And again, going back to reconstructions of home, it's talking about the real challenge of having a society that allows young people to sleep on the streets, but also that there are capacities within those spaces that people develop, innovations and communities that they develop to address these things. So they're not just completely disempowered people; they're complex realities. So representation to kind of go beyond the single story, and those are some of the principles that we've kind of been pulling out, including accessibility and this concept of reflective practice. Always making sure that we're not. We're not thinking that that there's a continual space for reflection, because that's really what equity work is about.
For anyone just tuning in, you're listening to The Drop, brought to you by York Region's Youth Strategy on 102.7 CHOP FM. And I like the self-reflection piece. I think a lot of what we've been trying to incorporate into our framework is having not just the four categories of listening, representation, accessibility, and then general reflection, but also having a preface, so that prior to even engaging in this work, there's almost, I don't want to say a code of conduct, but there's homework to be done before approaching this type of work at all. And that involves a lot of self-reflection and identification of social location. And it's an intrinsic part of really any EDI work. Mm-hmm. I also like that in one of our consultations, there was a flower power flower exercise brought to our attention, nice. Which for anyone who doesn't know it, one Google search will show you exactly what it is, but it's basically a diagram where each of the petals of this flower force you to ask questions about your social location. What background am I coming from culturally? What is my religious background? What are my gender pronouns? What is my sexual orientation? And so it forces you to ask all these things about yourself. And as you get closer to the center of the flower, you're able to identify just what your social location is. And then only then can we really start to reflect on some of the privilege and maybe lack thereof that comes along with that social location.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to think about how these are broad principles that each of the subcommittees within the youth strategy need to apply for themselves. Because even within the context of the EDI committee, we can't possibly reflect all of the different complex realities that need to be considered when thinking about the work plans and the actions that we need to do. It needs to be also taken up by the other subcommittees themselves, so that when they're thinking about the work that they need to do within their context, they are also reflective and thinking about these principles.
I think that's a really important point you just made as well, because it's not exactly possible for us to identify all of the different places people might be coming from. The same way when we say our committee is meant to ensure that we are preventing against all of the isms, we can't necessarily name every one of those isms. So it's important for the self-reflection piece to be something that each individual does going into it. Because I find everyone comes from a different place and everyone's got a very different social location. And this sort of leads into the next question I wanted to ask, which is there an ideal EDI review process? Like in a perfect world, what does this framework look like to both of you once it's complete? And I know we're far from completion.
Well, I think something we've been reflecting on throughout this discussion and throughout our work together is that there is no one set standard best. It's not like, okay, do a Google search and find the best framework out there and use that one. There's certainly principles that you will find in multiple frameworks, like the concepts of representation or accessibility. But those can also be very differently defined depending on the context or the project or the subcommittee, as Jericho was just saying. So I think the approach of cross-cutting and principles-based is, for me, a better practice. And so sometimes in academic speak, we're talking now about better practices instead of best practices, because that allows us to also reflect and go into that reflective sort of living place. But I think the principle of the fact that the subcommittees themselves know their work better than we do. So if we were the equity, standard, and we had to review everything and decide whether this is okay equity wise, whether it's a script or a work plan or something, we might miss something because we don't really understand the context of what the work is being developed. So again, going back to that context, it's not just because it's a better principle, it's a better practice if the people involved in the actual work are reflecting on these ideas because they know the context of what they're working in. So for me, it might look something like, we are providing an ongoing space to ensure that there is guidance around how to live the process of reflective practice around equity and diversity throughout the development and implementation of the strategy, so that committee, again, doesn't just get struck, exist in the development stages, and then disappear. It provides an ongoing reflective space. And we learn from what happens in the subcommittees as well. So they themselves apply the framework to their work. So it's not like we would review everything that comes out of every subcommittee. But there may be times that they come forward and they say, we have a challenge, or we're not sure how to address this particular issue. Or they might say there's parts of the framework that are missing that we found we had to ask these questions in order to get where we needed to be with a certain work plan. And so they want us to then go back to the framework and look at it again. And that's kind of the living process of how it provides guidance for the overall strategy.
Well, and Jericho and I were talking about this beforehand, where that way we are sort of a bottleneck in the review process, but we are not the only bottleneck. We have multiple iterations of EDI review happening across the board, where we have our subcommittees, each vetting themselves for EDI using the general framework we've created. And then it flows through us because, again, we're not necessarily the experts on the topics being discussed in each subcommittee. And it helps to have multiple opinions.
Yeah, I think it's important as well to, as James mentioned, think about calling in rather than calling out when it comes to this reflective and learning process, because there will be stumbling blocks along the way. There will be times when we need to make corrections, but it needs to be a safe space where we can talk openly and critically about, making these shifts to make it more inclusive, etc. I think that is also an important part of that process and is one of those underlying principles for the better practice as well.
Yeah, and I think just to give our listeners a bit of an idea of how the strategy is structured and where the EDI team kind of falls into in all this, we have 5 main subcommittees as well as a youth council. All are sort of operating laterally, but there is some communication between them, and they all have different initiatives. So the way, at least for my ideal, the way this framework will manifest is we're going to have these groups doing their own work. They perform their own EDI review based on whatever our finished product may be. That work ultimately flows through us as sort of the final seal of EDI approval, which would, again, follow everyone else doing their own EDI legwork. And then from us, it would go to the steering committee for board approval. And the reason I like this way is because it's not a rigid framework. It is a living document. Everybody is using it in the creation of the work, and we're using it in the review of that final product before it being okayed to sort of go to the end of the pipe. I also wanted to touch on resources that we're using in our EDI work. So I'll extend this one to Jericho. What kind of resources have we been using in the review process, and what do you think is the best way to decide which resources are used in the creation of the framework?
Yeah, I think for starting out this process, we looked at the EDI. Like there's an EDI document that Newmark had created. There are EDI documents that other service providers like CARE created. I think there is a plethora of resources out there if you do a pretty basic search. I think the really important part, though, is that you need to move beyond simply having those resources and having it sit on a policy shelf.
Mm-hmm.
EDI really is about embodying a lot of these as part of your ongoing and standard practice, rather than simply being that checklist or as mere reading material for your org. So, I think there are those out there, but as mentioned, it needs to be something that you bring to the team, that you make sure that everyone has an understanding of, and then is something that everyone lives through.
For anyone just tuning in, you're listening to The Drop, brought to you by York Region's Youth Strategy on 102.7 CHOP FM. I like that point you made, too, about not having it become part of the policy shelf. I know for me, I do a lot of work in disaster management and business continuity planning. And one of the biggest problems we run into there is that you create this all-encompassing plan that ends up on a shelf somewhere and is never revised, and it's not sort of a living process. It's just a one-time thing. And I think similarly, that's the problem we see with a lot of organizations in the EDI work they do. They spend the money, they create some document, and then they just kind of put it on a shelf and think it's going to stand the test of time. And as I'm sure we all know in this day and age, nothing necessarily stays politically correct for, a set amount of time. It's always a moving target.
Yeah. Or even within the context of, like my context of like service providers, clients know when your EDI policies are mere window dressing. It's felt, it's seen, it's experienced when they come to a space and they don't actually feel included, or that their needs are not actually being met, right? Like it's so important at the end of the day to have it go from this 10,000 view policy level down to the ground, because that's where it really matters, is how it can affect and impact your clients or the individuals that you serve.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
Yeah, people are intuitive beings, and I think we can tell when things are very superficial.
Mm-hmm.
It just feels disingenuous a lot of the time, but I think that's what we're trying to avoid here.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as resources go, I think one thing I would extend to our listeners is that we are open to suggestions about what the best resources are for a lot of the work we're doing here. I think with our framework, there's so many different components to it that we can't necessarily just draw on the glossary of terms and definitions on NACA's website. We can't necessarily just look at what Unlearn has to offer us. So I know some of what I've been looking into has been different university glossaries, because to accompany our framework and our sort of preface or mode of being, we also have a list of definitions, and it's an incomplete list, and it always will be. But sourcing those is a very tall order, because we need a million different places that we're pulling those things from.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of jumping forward, what advice would either of you have for other organizations seeking to take a more EDI-centric approach, and maybe basing your answers in the experiences we've had trying to create this framework? I'll extend this one to Charlotte first.
Sure. Yeah, I think it really goes to that last interchange that you had, James and Jericho, where you were talking about, the living the practice. And I think it also, if I was to summarize our discussion in a couple of words, maybe that whole concept of calling in is a good one. So, making sure that this is a cross-cutting approach, making sure that everybody in the strategy or in the organization or system that's trying to do EDI work is part of the discussion. That there aren't sort of EDI experts and then everybody else. So, because again, it's very context driven, it's very principles based, and I think that idea that we have these for good intentions, we come and we articulate principles often or policies when we're dealing with a complex system, and then they end up on a shelf because we get busy doing the day-to-day practice. So things don't always end up on shelves because people don't care. They end up on shelves because we get busy with these multi-pronged strategies. This is a complex strategy, and most of the work we're doing these days when we're trying to deal with systemic issues are complex. But at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we are walking the talk of those principles through ongoing reflective practice. And so we keep saying those words because we don't want to get to the point where, as Jericho just mentioned, the actual delivery of the service or the delivery of the policy or the mix of both in something like a strategy ends up not having equitable principles in it because there wasn't enough uptake throughout the process of implementation.
What I also take from what you just said is that when organizations are trying to do EDI work, when they're trying to create frameworks, they need to be constantly aware of the ever-changing nature of this type of work. So rather than just implementing it, we need to be continually revisiting the document. And even though we don't want it to be too rigid, it's not a terrible idea to put in sort of the terms of reference. We're going to revisit this document at these particular times, or we're going to open it up to public or internal suggestions so that we can continually be revising what we have.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Being open doesn't mean you don't have structure.
Yeah.
You need structure to remain open. So if you build in, first of all, a committee that doesn't just fold, that is there as a space, then that's some structure that allows the practice to live within the organization. And then also if you build in check-ins or whatever that looks like for your organization so that you have structure to allow the process to be a process. So yeah, just being open doesn't mean you just have it there and you think, oh, we'll do whatever it takes. You have to have some structure as well. But the other thing I think that's really important is being, and I think Jericho mentioned this as well, is being open to failure, or is being open to the disruption moments, because we know that this is a living process. We know it's very context driven. We know that it's complicated, and we know that it's power laden. So there are going to be moments that there are challenges where there might be something that gets implemented and then there's problems in relation to inclusion, and just having a review process and saying we looked at it, so we're not going to address the problem because we think it's inclusive, is not also reflective practice. You need to also be willing to hear criticism or disruption, go back to what you were doing and saying, okay, we tried to be inclusive, but we weren't fully successful here. So yeah, sometimes you do EDI work and then people say, well, we had the EDI committee look at it, so we're not going to deal with this critique. And that's actually the complete opposite of being reflective around EDI.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's so difficult though. Like it requires being humble, it requires being open, it requires being uncomfortable with the fact that you may have made a misstep, but it also requires learning on those mistakes and willing yourself to improve, which is incredibly important and is part of that, walking the walk of actually living through these principles.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's where cultural competence comes into. It's okay to misstep. It's okay to realize, oh, maybe that wasn't as EDI friendly as I thought it was, provided we're doing so in a way where we're acknowledging all of these things and we're actively seeking to change what needs to be changed.
Mm-hmm.
As far as EDI-centric advice I would give to other organizations, I think the biggest thing is just trying to bring as many stakeholders in as possible, especially stakeholders who are actually relevant to the community. I know you were both speaking earlier about this strategy we're working on, the youth strategy. is grounded firmly in the York region. So it's very important to have community stakeholders, not even just from like City of Toronto or overall GTA, but specifically based within York region. You need it to be relevant to the communities you're trying to help. And the other half of, I guess, the piece of advice I would give is sort of influenced by the work both of you have been doing, which is community-based work, participatory research, trying to get people involved who are actually in these positions and not necessarily just those who are self-proclaimed or otherwise experts on EDI. And I think even though our team hasn't done this intentionally, just sort of speaking on the recruitment piece that we were discussing before the podcast, I think it would be a really good idea to get more people, more representation on the EDI team who aren't just experts in the field, but more youth who are actually going through a lot of the stuff that the strategy is trying to tackle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when thinking about, to bounce off of James's point, how you involve stakeholders, I think it's important, one, to give them that voice, so that they are able to speak for themselves when thinking about the needs or experiences that they have, but also important to give them a vote, so to speak, to make sure that they are part of that decision-making process, so that it isn't just through those who already have, existing power within the system to vote on their stead, but they are themselves empowered to make those decisions. I think those two are important ways for us to include these stakeholders and to make sure that it remains person-centered. And I think that the youth strategy is doing a pretty good job at that at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's really important. At one point, there was this concept of a ladder of youth engagement. I don't know if anyone's seen that. I don't know if it's around too much anymore because maybe it's too hierarchical. But at the bottom of the ladder was this idea of consultation. And at the top of the ladder was this idea of co-decision making. And so what you're talking about, if you don't get a vote on what happens next, if you've been consulted, that's not actually really, dealing with equity and engagement, because you might be heard, but that might not actually influence what happens next. So having decision-making power is also part of inclusion. It's not just having that person at the table.
And you also may have been consulted on the researcher's terms instead of asking questions that you yourself helped write.
Exactly. Thinking about how that consultation happens, how that inclusion happens, and the way that it's actually structured is really also a really big part of this. Yeah.
Well, I think those are more or less all the questions I wanted to ask, but I never like to end interviews or podcasts on my terms, so I'll sort of extend to both of you the question of, is there anything else you'd like to add to this discussion? Are there any final thoughts that you think are important for our listeners to hear?
I think that one final thought that I would leave with is the fact that I really appreciated the space for my own learning. I think that being able to be in a committee like this, which has the kinds of reflexivity that it does, and has the kind of engagement. I mean, the fact that the two of you and others that we've also worked with throughout the sessions show up really interested in the process of this stuff, rather than sort of saying, let's just get this over with because I've got another meeting to get to, helps me learn how to do this work, because again, we're individually and collectively, we're all learning. So it's been great to remember that and to revisit all of those principles in my own sort of day-to-day practice.
Yeah, to bounce off of that, I love the collaborative environment that we're a part of. I love all of the different individuals that are willing to be a part of that table. And I think that we're doing some really great work, but as was emphasized throughout the meeting, it's still ongoing work. It's still work that requires us to continue to learn and improve ourselves, and to continue to embody those principles in the actions that we do every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my favorite part of this work so far has been moving from a place of the checklist mentality to this more open discussion about framework. And we find ourselves in this position now where it's like we're not an initiative-based subcommittee. We were just supposed to be a review board, but it's almost like we've taken on this initiative of creating a framework template that can be, again, there's no one size fits all, but loosely applied to other organizations so that they can do a similar thing to what we're doing in building this reflexive framework. If anyone wants a little bit more information about the work we're doing, you can feel free to visit the 360 Kids website. The youth strategy is a standalone collaborative, but 360 Kids does a lot of the facilitation. And we are always happy to have new recruits from all different walks of life on the EDI team. Charlotte, Jericho, thanks for joining me today. This has been The Drop on 102.7 CHOP FM.